Uh, like we all know that this session is going to talk about women's labor force participation. And in India, this is a particular puzzle for many researchers as well as policymakers because the traditional theory suggests that as and when the economy develops, the labor force participation is likely to follow a U shape. But in India, surprisingly, we do not find such a pattern. And even with a lot of improvement in economic indicators, the labor force participation is roughly around 27%, whereas in the rest of the world, the average labor force participation is 49%. And which is why we are still trying to understand it through various dimensions. And there is a lot of research that is being undertaken to study that. And uh, what has been understood is that in India, um, it's a collection of issues. So it is not only women-related issues or social norms, but it is a general problem with the nature of production process of the economy as well. So I'm very glad that in today's panel we have some papers which discuss a lot of various different aspects, which are dealing with vocational training. We have a paper which is talking about effect of free passes in public transportation. Then we have another paper which talks about uh, how urbanization has affected. So we'll come to it as and when um, you listen to the presentation. And I think this is a very important point for Bihar, or very important area for Bihar. And Harjot and Rashmi both will delve on this more because in Bihar, we are the labor force participation of women is much lesser than all India average. And together with that, the Bihar government and the current Chief Minister Nitish Kumar, he has he has a special interest in developing the status of women and empowering women. And the Bihar government has come up with several policies, including reservations in jobs as well as in political uh, positions, but still we do not see the kind of effects that we were expecting to. And with coming of the COVID pandemic, it is likely to be even worse because again, research shows that with any negative shock, it is the women and children who are affected more than anyone else due to the shock. So in today's panel, we hope to resolve some of the issues which we can in the short run, and also talk about some of the issues that would be important in the long run. So with that, I again welcome everyone, and now I request Clement to start his presentation. Thank you.
Hi, I hope you can hear me. Yes. Thank you very much for organizing this webinar. I think it's an extremely important topic in general, and I think your introduction has made that clear. But especially in the current situation. So I will present some findings from research on young rural women and men from Bihar and Jharkhand, and I'll say a few words about how vocational training programs can help them get formal jobs in urban areas. So to set the scene, I wasn't sure I would be the first to present, but just so that everybody has that in mind. Of course, in India, female labor force participation is very low, and it is true both for in rural and urban areas. If you're looking at, thinking about migration as being, unlocking opportunities or, helping people get access to labor markets that they would otherwise not access, this is very much true for men, Okay, so if you're looking at people migrating, most of the men migrating are actually migrating for work. This is not true for women. Okay, so most women who migrate do not work. So that suggests, as I guess Ashmita hinted at, like a whole set of issues and obstacles for women to get into the labor force and to get salary jobs that are, might be partly related to migration, but it's not only about migration. This is just showing to you what happens to women when they work. And women, when they work, they're much more likely to be doing self-employment, especially in rural areas, or casual work. Basically, almost none of them would be doing any sort of formal work. And if you're looking at urban areas, the picture looks a bit better and definitely looks better for men. But for women, the rates of participation to formal employment are still very low. So today, what I'll be talking about is actually a type of policy, an actual policy that's been in place in 2014, which is called DUDKY, which stands for Deen Dayal Upadhyay Gramin Kaushal Yojana, and that program is trying to tackle the problems of access of rural youth to the labor market in general, but with a special focus on women. Okay, so there's actually are quotas for women, and this program is quite unique, or definitely more advanced than other sort of training programs that have been out there, because it has a heavy emphasis on placement. And actually, every trainee that sits in a training program has a job lined up, because the training providers have tied up with employers, and there's commitment from employers to actually hire them. So this program is really trying to heavy-handedly, with a lot of resources and guidelines and monitoring, really heavy-handedly trying to effectively get rural youth, and especially rural young women, into formal employment. And it is doing so in large numbers, although, as you see, out of 1 million youth who were trained, only 500,000 were placed. So there are issues related to the take-up of those jobs. So this 1 million of youth, theoretically, they all got a job offer, but not all of them took it. So there still are some constraints. So we've been studying these DDGY programs in Bihar and Jharkhand, with a very close collaboration with BRLPS, JSLPS, and the OMRD, and we're very grateful for that. So there's multiple experimental projects, but none of what I will show you today is experimental, so it should be taken with a grain of salt. Those are descriptives that we're trying to interpret. So the first, what data do we use? So we have a sample. Everything I presented now was national representative. Now we'll zoom in. We'll zoom in on what we think is an interesting population. It's a population that's composed 57% of female. People are quite young, maybe on average 19 or 20. They often come from disadvantaged background, large share of ST and SC. And they're relatively, have a lower level of education. So we're not talking about the stars of the labor market. We're talking about people who are semi-skilled and who come into this program with, relative social disadvantage in terms of getting jobs. And we are following them. We've met them. We interviewed all of them at the training center, and then we follow them on the phone. And we were able to maintain relatively low level of accuracy, so we were able to really cover them. And we cover them after the training. We cover them just, after the lockdown, and then 1 year after the lockdown in March 2021. The co-authors, and sorry, I should have said that earlier, Pascal Chakravarti, Max Lerner, Poonam Panda, Bharat Bhatia, and Roland Ratlo. There's also Vijay Arunan Palam. And we have a funding from Equipia, SASI, Warwick, and IGC. So the first descriptive statistic I wanted to share with you is what's the outcome of this training program. And I don't know if you want to see the glass half empty or half full, but focusing on the women who have enrolled in this training program, at the end, 50% of them have a job 5 months after the completion of the program. Okay, so there is a very decent, a good performance in terms of getting women into jobs, actually. Okay, and this is really driven by the fact that women are less likely, very few of them drop out of the training. If they're trained, roughly 60% of them get placed, and if they get placed, 80% of them stay. And I think that's a very interesting gender pattern here, because if you look at the men, everything is lower. And what this suggests is that, for women, this training and placement is a unique opportunity. And if they have it, they make the most of it. And it's really getting them into those jobs. Okay. So now coming to the current situation, which is, of course, what happened with COVID, we've been following this sample from the pre-lockdown situation to just after the lockdown was released in June, July, 1 year after lockdown, March, April 2021. And here, those are graphs, there's lots going on, but I'll try to guide you through it. And basically the idea is that you start with 41% of these trainees who had a salaried job before lockdown. 8% were in informal work and 50% were not earning. We'll be focusing on those who had a salaried job. And as you see, almost half of them, a bit less than half of them, actually lost their job. Okay, so from 40%, we're down to 27% into the salaried job. What did the other people do? Well, either they went into not earning, into just being at home, or they went into informal work. And actually, in the longer run, this pattern is continuing, meaning even fewer people in this salaried job, even more people doing informal work. What is very interesting, and hopefully will be of interest to this panel, is that there are stark differences by gender. And here the graphs are very small, so I'll just give you the overall picture. The idea is that, as I showed you, women, there's a high share of women who are in salaried work to start with, because that's the achievement from the program. However, many of them are dropping out. Some of them are dropping out right away. In the long run, even more of them are dropping out. We're going for 40% of women in salaried employment, 20% 1 year later. Now, there are two things going on. One thing is the COVID situation. As we know, there's been a big shock in the labor market for everyone. And there are gender aspects to this, which is that women are more likely to be called home, to be, attracted back into domestic work to eventually get married. So this pressure is there. Whereas for men, we have a very different picture, with a lot of men being attracted into informal work. Okay, salary job is not there. Coming home, what do? They do informal work. Okay, so they are still in the labor force. Now, if that's just a different way to look at the same sort of categorizing these trajectories, we're focusing on the subsample who. But then there were a lot of people who lost their job and never recovered, just remained in domestic work, and that's 50% of the women, only 25% of the men. Whereas for the men, there's a bit more of informalization or recovery or formalization. There's a bit more going on in the labor. So I don't know how much time I have left, because I have a few things to say on migration, but I don't have to. Do I have? Sorry, Ashmita, you.
Yeah, just take a few more minutes.
Yeah. Okay. So just to say that basically what I said about the access to formal work and women dropping out of formal work and going into this domestic work, this is also related to migration back, reverse migration. And so you've seen it in the news, etc. Of course, what happened, a major effect of the COVID crisis and the lockdown was that the jobs disappeared. And employers fired their workers, and then people migrated back as soon as they could. And this is definitely true of our sample. Okay, so we're starting with roughly 1/3 of people outside of the state, and they're just going home. And at the end of the day, we're left with maybe 1/5, 1/6 of people still outside of state. And that's true for women, even more so than for men. So many of them went back home and stayed home. What's even more perhaps worrying and something that our survey gives us a bit of a sense to is looking to the future. If you ask these women and these men, would you like to migrate in the future and take a job outside of your state? It's roughly 1/3 of the men. It used to be 1/4 of the women, when just after the lockdown. Now it's down to 17% for women, whereas it's stable for men, which really suggests that basically women are now discouraged and they won't migrate again. So to conclude, and those are really, of course, descriptive figures, but hopefully that give a bit of a frame of what might be going on. So, in general, access to this formal salaried job is difficult for women in India, especially when you're coming from rural areas, and this involves some migration. Really, there is an example, and we think a very positive example of training and placement policies that manage to get this rural youth into these formal jobs outside of states. Very important of course, in Bihar and Jharkhand. However, due to COVID, we've seen that many of the rural migrants have lost their jobs, went back home, but strong patterns, different patterns for men and women. While men went back in maybe to do casual informal work, women went back home to do domestic work and eventually get married. So we're thinking that without assistance, basically, this woman will not migrate again or take up formal jobs again. So I'll stop there. I'm sorry for that.
Thanks a lot, Clément. Now I would quickly turn to Deepika, who would present her work on how peer effects work in call center. So please, Deepika, you have 10 minutes till 4:01 India time.
Hi, Ashmita, thank you for the introduction. Can you guys see my slides? Or
yeah, they are visible.
Okay. So I will be presenting my paper on gender peer effects in the workplace. It was a field experiment which I conducted in Indian call centers. So traditional gender norms are likely to increase the cost of hiring women. And female labor force participation rates, as we are aware, have been declining in India and most South Asian countries in the last 2 decades, and they are particularly, female labor force participations are particularly hit because of the COVID-19 pandemic. So adverse gender norms and gender segregation practices in India and other South Asian countries may further increase the entry barriers to women. Firms might be skeptical of integrating women into the workplace, and there is some evidence of gender discriminatory practices from India. So removing barriers to entry in the workplace will be crucial in boosting the labor supply of women. So it's important to study gender interactions in the workplace and how it impacts productivity in such a setting. So what can be the effect of productivity in mixed gender teams versus same gender teams? There can be some competing effects of social interactions. So there could be decreases in productivity in individuals in mixed gender teams if there is less peer pressure due to less mutual monitoring, if there is higher transaction cost of interaction causing communication and coordination problems in mixed gender teams. And there can also be socialization, dating, and distraction in mixed gender teams, which could be decreasing their productivity relative to same gender teams. And on the other hand, mixed gender teams can also have higher productivity than same gender teams if there is knowledge complementarities and spillovers among workers. So we know that there is a chance that there can be decreases in productivity in mixed gender teams, especially in this kind of setting. So the research question that I pose is, does the gender of one's co-worker matter? Specifically, does the gender of one's co-worker impact one's productivity, learning, comfort, gender attitude, job satisfaction, and socialization? These are secondary outcomes that I measure. So the overview of the experiment was, to my knowledge, this was the first individual level randomized controlled trial to study the impact of gender diversity in the workplace on employee productivity. This randomized 765 individual workers into mixed gender teams or control groups of same gender teams. And the setting was the call center industry in call centers in 5 Indian cities. So the 5 Indian cities in the study are Patna, Noida, Udaipur, Hubli, and Mumbai. So they're all located in different states as well. And after the new teams were formulated, the workers were made to sit together for a median of 12 weeks. And then to intensify the exposure to opposite gender, individuals assigned to mixed gender teams were made to sit on alternate seats. So they were sitting quite close to each other. The main outcomes that I study in this paper is share of days work during the study period, which is a composite measure of attendance and retention. And at the intensive margin, I look at daily level productivity. So this data on daily level productivity is collected internally by firms. So it's individual level high quality data collected daily by firms using automatic technology. The two call center partners in the study were called to Connect India Private Limited and 5splash Infotech Private Limited. For behavior and attitude outcomes, which are the secondary outcomes, I conducted a survey both at the baseline and endline. And the questions were on gender attitude, job satisfaction, knowledge sharing, dating, peer monitoring and support, and comfort with opposite gender at work. And to look at heterogeneity or differential treatment effects on norms, I conducted information on individuals' prior exposure to opposite gender, their gender attitude, and the autonomy or empowerment or decision making. So these workers who are assigned to teams, they are actually working individually, doing individual tasks. However, there is some evidence from the economics literature that low-skilled or routine tasks have significant and larger peer effects than high-skill-intensive jobs. There could be a concern that this is more of an externality problem. So how does a person who is of a different gender and sits next to you in the workplace, how does that impact your productivity? So even though the workers are not working together on a particular task and doing individual work, it's still, there is some evidence that they do learn from each other. Particularly in this setting, they have daily interactions with their team members in team meetings. It is standard practice for teams to sit together. And at the baseline, when I asked the question on who do you ask for help when you're stuck on a call, 27% of the workers agreed that they primarily go to their co-workers for help, and 66% agreed that they learned something from the workers sitting next to them. This is a picture of a male-only team from a call center in Patna. And if you see, they are sitting quite close to each other. So if the team leader or supervisor is not around, they ask each other for help if they are stuck on a call. So what do I find? I find an overall zero effect, precisely estimated zero effect for both male and female employees on both productivity and share of days work during study period. I say that these are precisely estimated zero effect because the coefficients are quite small and close to zero, and the standard error is quite low, and the null value lies in the tight confidence intervals around these coefficients. So, and I find this result for the Patna as well, that there is a precisely estimated overall zero effect for male workers on productivity and share of days work during the study period. And on secondary outcomes, I find an increase in knowledge sharing for men who are assigned in mixed gender teams compared to those in all male teams. So there's a 0.3 standard deviation increase in knowledge sharing, which was an index on questions on whether they learned something from the workers sitting next to them. There's a 19 percentage point increase in dating compared to the baseline of 54% dating in all male teams, which is a 35% increase in dating, which was if you were dating somebody not married in mixed gender teams at the end line. And when asked, call centers were wary that male employees assigned to mixed gender teams would not be receptive to feedback in front of female co-workers. So this question was added after consulting with the call centers, and I find that males in mixed gender teams are more comfortable with opposite gender and receiving feedback in front of opposite gender than men in all male teams. For female workers, I find an increase in peer monitoring and support. There's a concern that women, because they're sitting so close to men in these mixed gender teams, might not be comfortable. But this result, which is an index of questions on whether they were comfortable in their teams and whether they received support from their teammates, I find a 0.2 standard deviation increase in self-reported peer monitoring and support received by female workers in mixed gender teams relative to those in all female teams. And when I look at differential treatment effect on norms, I find that conditional on being assigned to mixed gender teams, men with progressive gender attitudes have significantly higher productivity than men with regressive gender attitudes. What this means is that compared to men who were within mixed gender teams, men who were assigned to mixed gender teams, men who had progressive gender attitudes to begin with had higher productivity than men with regressive gender attitudes to begin with. And women with high autonomy, so women who had more decision-making powers about their earning, about what clothes they wore, about how they spent their earning, about who they traveled with, and had more control over these decisions. These types of women had significantly higher share of days work during the study period than women with lower autonomy. So women who were assigned to mixed gender teams, women with higher autonomy amongst that group showed up to work more than women with lower autonomy. So the policy relevance, there's some policy relevance and implications for firms and workplaces. This study provides evidence that it is not costly for firms to hire women, especially in male-dominated workplaces in countries with adverse gender norms. Particularly in the post-COVID world, when there will be, if there is more entry barriers for women, this provides evidence that it is not costly for firms to hire women. In fact, improving gender attitudes among men is crucial for boosting productivity in gender-integrated workplaces. This also has implications for the call center industry, which is for employment in the call center industry. It is the largest private sector employer in India, employing around 4 million people. And the central government under the India BPO promotion scheme to open up branches in smaller cities and to hire women. So more such policies can potentially increase female labor force participation and incentivize firms to hire more women. Another interesting result was that gender-integrated workplaces can lead to social integration. In India, where more than 90% of the marriages are within caste, intra-caste, this kind of social interaction within the workplace can lead to increases in dating and lead to more social integration. I would like to thank IGC India for their support in conducting this experiment. And I would also like to thank Ministry of Electronics and IT and Software Technology Parks of India in connecting with me to call centers, and Bihar Industries Association. And I would also like to thank my partner call centers, Call to Connect India Private Limited and 5splash Infotech Private Limited. Thank you for the opportunity to present.
Thanks a lot, Deepshika. I'm sure there would be many questions directed towards you, but thanks. It's really interesting. And I hope that your policy implications would be heard by her throat and she would respond to it. But before that, I would like to move to Gabriel, who would present his work, which is talking about safety in numbers and how free public transportation for women and women's safety works for women's safety. Yeah.
Hello, thank you very much, Ashmita, and please let me know if there's anything with the sound or the visuals that doesn't work. Thank you to IGC for supporting this study and to the organizers for including it in this panel. This is joint work with Girija Borkar at the World Bank and Dev Patel, a graduate student at Harvard. And I'll talk to you today about women's urban mobility barriers and Delhi's free public transport policy. To begin, let me start by pointing out the fact that cities offer unrivaled access to jobs, but also to other important aspects of welfare and well-being, be it access to high-quality educations, good services, mentoring networks, medical care, etc. Of course, to benefit from these opportunities, one has to reach them, and so urban mobility is a necessary condition for realizing these opportunities. And at the same time, in cities in India and in many countries in the world, women are underrepresented in public spaces and in public transportation in particular. And this is as much, of course, a symptom of low labor force participation and other issues talked about today, but it can also be a cause by making transport and mobility less safe and be perceived less safe. And so understanding policies that increase and facilitate urban mobility for women is economic activity and life in general. And in this context, we study a very interesting policy experiment conducted by the Delhi government, launched at the end of towards the end of the 2019, whereby all women passengers in the city could travel for free on all buses in the city. So this worked very simple in practice. Instead of paying the conductor in the bus, they would just receive a pink ticket. At the same time, the government launched a complementary policy by ramping up their pre-existing program of bus marshals. So recognizing the issues of safety and the risk of sexual harassment and harassment of other kinds that women face in public transportation, the government added bus marshals to every bus in the public bus system. And so in this study, we are looking at the mobility impact in the short term after the launch of this policy. I'm going to talk to you about multiple high-frequency data sources that we use to understand and gain some insights into what happened. And I'll also show you results from a complementary experiment that we ran with a sample of women in Delhi that offers a different angle and onto increasing mobility for women. So throughout our focus, it will be directly on urban mobility, taking for granted these benefits that come from higher access to what the city has to offer. So let me jump right in. The first data source that we use consists of observations of buses at bus stops. So surveyors were positioned in 50 randomly sampled bus stops across Delhi, and they collected data on all the buses that came by. And I'll first show you results on the number of women passengers that were observed, starting 1 week before the policy start and going all the way to 8 weeks after. And we see a very large increase, a bit gradual, but starting from an average of 5 women passengers per bus, this goes up by 50% to something around 7.5. Now, this is another view of the same result using different data. So this is related, but this is survey of bus passengers in bus stops in Delhi. This data was actually collected by another team of researchers who were kind enough to include these questions in their study. And here we're breaking it up by men and women and plotting how much they've used the bus in the past week. What we see is a similar pattern for women, a large increase, as well as a reversal. So initially they're using the bus less than men in the sample, but by the end of the period, they do so more. And this reversal is highly statistically significant. Another interesting view is asking who among women are those who take up this policy. And so here, in the same data, we split up by education, and we see a very diverging pattern. So low education women, there's not much change in mobility. They start with the lower baseline, and that continues. Whereas high education women ramp up quickly after the policy launch, and kind of this number stays high. And in addition, using these similar data, these two data sources that I've mentioned, we find that the increase in in women's ridership did not lead to higher crowdedness, which is one potential negative effect considered ex ante. And we also investigate the bus marshal program by itself. And here we have 2 points. First, it was, according to our data, it was faithfully implemented. So after the policy, essentially every bus had a visible bus marshal from the bus stop. However, we see similar ridership effects in groups of buses, types of buses, and times of the day that had small increases in bus marshals. So had bus marshals at the start already, as well as others that saw a large increase. So we don't see a difference there. Now let me zoom in to understand mobility more generally on a sample of over 700 women from low and middle income wards, 15 wards that we randomly sampled from Delhi, for whom we have more detailed data. So a baseline in-person survey, as well as phone surveys every 2 weeks, which collected data on overall mobility. And let me say that at baseline, women travel in the sample, travel outside their neighborhood. This was a condition for being in the sample. And they're a mix in terms of 20% commute to work. Others do a lot of trips for shopping, accompanying family members, medical trips, etc. And I'm also going to show you results from an experiment that I'll mention in just a bit. So first, let me reiterate the point I made earlier. In this low SES, so lower income sample, we don't see before versus after any major change in mobility or usage of the bus. So this is the part of the sample that was not was a control group in our experiment. Now let me go back to the experiment that we ran. So we created a bus pass intervention. So we had a more personalized version of the citywide policy. That is, a little bit before the policy was launched, we delivered to women a bus pass that had their name, photo, as well as the value of the pass directly to their home. This was using data collected at the baseline survey. And what we see here is, what I'm showing here is the effect of receiving this type of bus pass relative to not in our sample in terms of the number of bus trips made yesterday. So we see no difference before the delivery of the bus pass, and then an increase and a kind of stable increase even after the policy gets launched. So it seems that this additional personalized touch in our data shows a meaningful impact on mobility in this sample, and that this is persistent, even not washed out by this citywide policy. We also find that this translates into higher overall mobility. Not only is not substitution from other modes into bus travel, so it is overall, and as well as in the number of trips made alone by women in our samples. Importantly, we don't detect any decrease or change in reported trip safety because of this intervention. The results are not very strong in terms of what kind of trips, but the suggestive evidence are these additional trips are errands as well as medical trips. So to move on to policy implications from our studies, there are two major points we'd like to make. The first one is that mobility subsidies are plausibly and often maybe intended for low-income, lower education populations. Nevertheless, we find that this may not be the way that they are taken up. So in our case, we see a very large take-up from high education, but more muted effect from the citywide policy, at least in the short run. And so this is something that policymakers should take into account. And secondly, we find from the experiment that we ran, we find a suggestive evidence that more personalized information interventions, may help reach low-income women's mobility more precisely. And as I've mentioned, we are focusing here on the short term, but I want to point out, of course, that mobility impacts may take longer to be realized. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Gabriel. And let me just quickly go on to today's last presentation on women, work, and the State, Service Provision and Female Labor Force by Nilanjan Sarkar. So over to you, Nilanjan.
Share my screen. You're all able to see my screen? Okay. I just want to sort of reorient the presentation a bit. This is actually a part of a much larger study. The blog that was written for IGC was around measurement issues, but this is a study across, and I'll talk a little bit more about it because we have very little time, across 4 urban clusters, 14,000 households that looked not just female labor force participation, also it looked at workplace conditions, mobility, permissions that are required in the home, intra-household inequality, time use, right? So this was a much larger undertaking. The IGC helped us quite a bit. So did the Ford Foundation, so the Gates Foundation. It's a larger project. So what I'm going to be presenting today is a small sliver of that project, but hopefully something that find helpful. It's highly synergistic with the last presentation that we just heard about mobility, because I'm looking at the role of urbanization on female labor force participation. And I would say the role of this study is to think a little bit more carefully about what actual labor market preferences from women have to say about labor market supply and labor market demand, especially as India is urbanizing. Okay, I'm not going to spend much time on this. There is a U-shaped hypothesis when it comes to female labor force participation. We've all spoken about it. What is difficult in the context of India is let me just also say that this is a kind of regression that, are you able to hear me clearly? Yes. This is a kind of regression that maybe would have passed muster in 1991. I think today, looking at the spread of points and the curve, we would be a little more skeptical. Right. Okay. This is just from World Bank development indicators to give some sense of the larger policy question. India now has the lowest female labor force participation, according to these indicators, modeled ILO estimates in all of South Asia. This is the policy question in one graph, right? This is where female labor force participation used to look like. And from the mid 2000s, it drops like a rock, right? So when we want to think about why does female labor force participation look bad in India, this is actually what we need to understand, right? A major macro level downward shift in female labor force participation from the mid 2000s. Okay. So this is basically saying that in numbers. Let me just sort of give a sense of what the macro picture is. This is all data that many of you will know. We know that the agricultural labor force is the disproportionate employer for women in India. India is urbanizing very quickly. That means that the rural labor force is shrinking, partially due to mechanization, partially due to other factors. There is no reservoir among labor force demand, among demanding women, jobs for women in the urban space that looks anything like agricultural labor. So simply mechanically, as you urbanize, you are looking at a huge drop in female labor force participation. Another way of reorienting the question is, what are the characteristics of the urban labor force market that are making it less plausible or less, making it less able for women to enter the market? Just to be very, very clear on the mechanism here, when we think about rural to urban transformations in India, most of the urbanization or the change in rural to urban population isn't coming from migration. It's actually coming from reclassification, right? Rural areas turning into urban areas. So it may not be, and it is not typically the case that women are sort of dropping out of the labor force in rural areas and trying to see if they can get a job in urban areas. What we know from the data, including our data, is that once a woman drops out of the labor force, it's highly unlikely she's going to enter back in. But there are generational shifts, right? So an older generation might be engaged in agricultural labor. Today, that area looks less agricultural in nature. The younger generation is not entering back into it. Okay. So I want to sort of think about three micro level preference based explanations for why someone may or may not enter the labor force. One is there's a positive or negative income shock. This is one that we know. Household is making more money. I opt out of the labor force. The household is making less money. I'm pushed into the labor force. Another question is that do I have other people there to help me within the household? Let's say an extended family setup. There are more able bodies to take care of my household duties. So therefore, women are able to enter the labor force at a greater age, right? And the third is, and the one that I'm most interested in, is social norms that govern space, which is irrespective of what other demographic factors we have, changes, education, income. Is there an expectation for women to be doing a certain amount of work at home? And that is creating complicated trade-offs between entering the labor force outside the home and executing duties within. Okay, so this is intended for a more general audience. There are no Greek symbols here. Let me just sort of populate a decision theoretic model for you, and then I'm going to try to give you some circumstantial evidence that there's a reason to think about this here. So I'm interested in the context in which a woman is deciding to work outside the home, right? There are a lot of reasons for us to think about gender mobility as an important variable, right? And the allocation problem a woman faces is that I have a certain duty at home, but I get a certain wage for working outside. Now, we do know that in many rural-urban transformations, you can often wage your way out of the problem. We have certain examples of that. Wage offered in the workplace is huge, pulls women to the labor force. That's not what we think is happening in India, right? The form of urbanization that we have is not deeply industrially driven, right? So there's just sort of a change of the composition of labor sectors. Okay? So often, because of this allocation problem, we argue, and you can sort of show this quite technically, that the preference ordering for many women will be to work part-time, then no work, then full-time. And what's going on underneath this is that because I have to trade off and I have to, with work at home, I have to expend a certain amount of effort to finish my tasks at home, that I require some level of proximity, right? I need to be near the home, and I require some level of flexibility to deal with tasks at home. So agriculture often gives you that, right? You have fields next to the home, right? Whereas in urban areas, that reservoir of jobs that have the characteristics of flexibility and proximity are less pronounced. Okay? Can I just quickly ask how much time I have? About 5 minutes, okay.
I think you can just take 2 more minutes.
Sorry, 4 minutes? What?
No, I think you can take 2 more minutes. So you already spent 10 minutes.
I have. Oh, wow. Okay. Sorry. So let me just quickly go to the main results. So this is a study that that was taken over 4 urban clusters, right? And we intend to get the entire urban-rural gradient, female and male respondent in every household, and within 2 hours of the center of the city. So we're getting agricultural and urban clusters. Okay. You can see that Patna actually is doing much better than Bihar as a whole here, right? It is what you might expect. What you notice is that women are disproportionately engaged in agriculture, much more than men. Dhanbad, which has the lowest female labor force participation, also has the lowest engagement in agriculture because it's a manufacturing town. So there are many more women in unskilled labor. But that gives us this first view that once you urbanize, you're getting much lower female labor force participation. This sort of shows that even when you're looking at income, you can control for any demographic factor. The dark blue curve shows that rural female labor force participation is always going to outstrip urban labor force participation in our sample in any. We also ask for preferences for work. Around 60% of women do express a preference for entering work, even if they're unemployed, but that's disproportionately part-time. When we ask what is the main reason for why you want to enter work, or what are the main sort of characteristics, you do see that disproportionately it is things like taking care of the work at home, the job is nearby, the family approves, right? Being qualified for a job is not a major criterion for wanting to enter. Okay, so just very quickly, we did a survey experiment. We took 3 variations to unemployed female respondents in those 4 urban clusters. We asked whether a job was available in the neighborhood or an hour away, whether somebody from the family could come to help or not, whether the primary wage earner had to leave work, full stop. And what we found is that manipulating, just asking for people's preferences across the 4 clusters, from taking a job in the neighborhood to an hour away, it caused 12 to 23 percentage point decrease in the willingness to enter the labor force. We get very inconsistent effects across the other prompts. I can have a more detailed discussion about what may or may not have worked in those prompts. Okay, so final policy implications. I've already talked about the principles of flexibility and proximity, and thinking a little bit about, given that we are often dealing with conservative social norms, how does urban labor market demand intersect with the needs and the demands for flexibility and proximity from women? One way of thinking about how to make the urban labor market better is, can you reduce the cost of movement across space, basically making everything more proximate, making life more flexible, right? And the third final point I want to make here is that Bihar has a lot of census towns. Urbanization is a fact. We're not looking at huge levels of industrialization where wage is going to come out of nowhere. And so we need to start thinking about what are the kinds of policy implications for the kind of urbanization that we are seeing in India, and how do we perhaps reduce the costs of movement, move plausible work near the home, if we are interested in integrating women into the labor force as the agricultural labor force today.
Thanks, Nilanjan, for this insightful presentation and providing these deep-rooted observations. I hope that we would come back to it once we have the discussion. Now, I would like to invite Harjot Kaur to give her comments. She is the Managing Director of Women Development Corporation, Government of Bihar. Shri Kaur, please give your comments on the presentation and what you think is relevant from the policy point of view.
Yeah. Good afternoon, everybody. Hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Well, first of all, I would like to thank IGC for giving me this opportunity to listen to such wonderful people who have presented their own studies about various aspects of women empowerment and what they've seen, why the women female labor force participation in India is going down, and they've also done some policy research about various policy decisions taken by different states and how they have impacted the female labor force participation. Well, I would be definitely speaking about Bihar. My work experience is more about Bihar, though of course it can be a little generic about India also. It's a given fact, as everybody has acknowledged, that the female labor participation rate in India is declining over the years. Now, what can be the main reason for it? I think many speakers have already shed some light on that. But in the case of Bihar, I think the main, one of the basic reasons or primary concerns is the low educational attainment of women. I think compared to any other state in India, Bihar lags behind in women literacy rates. And even if you look at the NHFS survey, which has recently come out, NHFS 5, it says only 61% of women in Bihar have ever attended school. but that doesn't mean that they are literate. The literacy rate is still 57.8%. So if you really want to be in the labor market, and if you don't want to be doing manual work or manrega, or you're doing something in the agriculture field, which generally has the maximum number of women participating in that sector, agriculture, then women have to be a little educated. Only then they can move into the service sector or the industry sector and get jobs there, number one. Number two, the fertility rate and the age of marriage of women in Bihar again is adverse. The prime time when a woman would like to work or has the capacity to work, she still doesn't have children, or she doesn't have to be too much bothered about the household work or everything, is the time she gets married, at the age of 18 or even less than that. At that point of time, she is not able to have any education, let alone take part in the. But apart from various other reasons, which we all know as to why female labor participation rate is going down in India, I think we are not talking about the digital divide or how digital literacy can change the things in India. I think maybe it can be a game changer in India, considering the fact that women have issues about mobility, women have issues about moving too far ahead, women have issues about taking care of are the major caregivers in a family, and they have to devote a large part of their time on looking after children or ailing parents or whatever. So if we can really have some kind of a digital literacy for women in India, I think, as somebody had said, that the majority of the women are self-entrepreneurs or they are self-employed. I think they can stay at home, they can still work, and they can still earn. And I think, Ashmita, you must be aware, I think there are many Jivika studies in which there's one particular study of Jivika in which they have basically just before COVID, they had this digital literacy awareness workshop for rural women. And it was quite at the right time, as they say, and then the pandemic hit us. And after the initial problems with it, but then they settled down and then they started doing what they had learned in that program. And they were able to re-establish their enterprises and work towards self-employment even during the pandemic. Digital literacy has a lot of advantages. The woman can be at home. She doesn't need to go out of the house. She can also have a little flexi hours. If she's self-employed, she takes out the time herself when she will be devoting it to her this thing, giving the time frames of different parts of the world. I think it helps her. Access to finance, which is one of the major reasons women are not able to go for any kind of entrepreneurship. I think the web-based financial instruments also help her in getting finance, which the traditional financial organizations are unable to do so. And then I think there are, if you look at the digital platform, you'll also find there are many new platforms about how to assess the viability of a women's entrepreneur, whether to invest money on it. So those kind of out-of-box solutions are very much required if India, and especially Bihar, wants to take a quantum jump in female labor participation rate. And if you don't mind, I'll ask a little more questions a little later. I had also written a few. I wanted to ask a few participants about what they were saying, especially as there was a difference in the mobility factor in Delhi buses, why women with high educational attainment were more prone to using those free buses rather than the women who were low educational attainment. So I think maybe you find that as a policymaker, I can say that women are not a unified group. We have to have different kind of policies for different kind of subsets of women. So there could be very highly educated women who have their own set of problems about why they are not able to access work or why they are not able to participate freely into the labor market. And then you have the low income women or the low educational attainment women who have their own problems. Then there could also be problem related to age and other skill levels and things like that. So it's not it can't be a one size fits all. We have to basically have policy frameworks for different subsets of women. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank,
Harjot,
yeah.
for
Thank
your
you.
comments. I think you made this very important point about digital literacy, and possibly that would also connect with what Deepshika was talking about. That if we have more women who are digitally literate coming into the service sector, uh, which is now mostly male dominated because of the lack of education attainment levels of women, overall productivity in the economy could also increase, and no, and that would see further participation by women.
Just a simple smartphone in the hands of a woman can really change her life. She can access educational programs, she can access government services, she can access any kind of information which is crucial for her at that particular time. And it's like a small window that she has with the world in which she can interact with different people, even exchange notes with women who are similarly placed. So we are trying to do that in Bihar more and more, especially because of the pandemic, which has made us all relook our policies. Because with this kind of a scenario, I think that the traditional methods will really need a relook.
Right. Thanks a lot, Harjot ji. Now I will move to Shri Rashmi Singh, who is the Director of Department of Women and Child Development, Government of Delhi. Uh, Ma'am, please give your comments on the presentation. And
So,
yeah.
okay, so first of all, like, yeah, good that very meaningful, engagement that I find on this issue. And not only, contextual, but, also looking at, yeah, different state-specific interventions. And particularly Delhi was talked about, like when we looked at one of the major areas which does affect, women's workforce participation, that is mobility. And mobility, the research finding which came out, and that did set me thinking that you are, while we are looking at the good practices, we also looking at what more needs to be done, in terms of what the research is telling us. Why I say this is because I will straight away go to the policy issue that when you look at one good practice and then combine it with some other, like, I think, yeah, just try and combine it with, some other measures like last mile connectivity. Like bus is a very good example, but combined with last mile connectivity, where buses don't go, right? And for like, for women, it may be kind of difficult, to again negotiate with the public space in which, traveling from the bus stop, down to the houses may not be as safe. In Delhi, we had something called a safety, audit conducted, where like, the lights which were not working, or the areas which are otherwise unsafe, and like, how that impacts a women's mobility. So all that issue was taken up. So I do realize that, we do need to then talk about a very integrated, ecosystem as a whole. But what goes into that ecosystem has to be very well crafted, because it's easier said than done. So it needs to be like, I think there are like kind of like three kind of M's that we're looking at is mapping, mapping, mapping. But apart from mapping, what is important is matching also. So matching between the demand and the supply. And the third, I would say, is, measure. So keep measuring the outcome, keep measuring the change, the impact, the result, whatever the schemes that we bring out. So it's important, and that too on a real-time basis. And unfortunately, in this particular case, you can't really compare it with like what you would find in terms of the impact in normal times. Because if you look at like the timing, say December 19, and then like, yeah, the kind of period that the whole year has gone by. So obviously the business has been affected in any case, and women's mobility would have actually led to probably better results, had it the times been normal. So we are looking at like two things. One is like, yeah, the immediate, the crisis, what's the learning in the crisis as an emergency, immediate response, but at the same time, learning from this crisis, being prepared, even in the long term, being prepared with, the kind of solutions that we need to, look at, bringing a combination of measures That's, in my view, very, very important. And in that combination of measures, of course, it is the role of the government, but at the same time, the societal response. Why I'm saying the societal response? Because we are, even in other presentations, talking about the adverse gender norms. We are talking about, the biases, the prejudices. So the mindset issue, right? I mean, and particularly in COVID times, while it is good for women to work at home, but I know the kind of pressures which they've also been facing with the kind of expected responsibility of caregiving at home. So the professional work, and at the same time, the gender role not really changing, where the household work, where the, caregiving role is still expected to be, primarily that of a woman. So that also has to change. So yeah, the need for adaptation, has to be like set in a better momentum than what it is today. Because, in many of the educated families and many of the so-called progressive families, one hears the kind of, I would say, the price which it takes on a woman's physical health and the mental health, the emotional health, to balance all these roles, only because, the issue of the age-old traditional mindset, is not willing to change and adapt at the level, at which we expect it to do at all levels. Because, why I'm saying at all levels is, again, because, for many of us, the experience would be different. But I'm talking about like the various layers, which Harjot ji also spoke about, like, the different layers of vulnerability, so having to address that. The other is like, we also need to look at where the women lose out. Yeah, it's not just today as adults, adult professionals, but also it's like an entire life cycle, where girls who are growing up as, in their adolescent age. So, at that point of time, again, it is like something where, we find that even though there are opportunities, it's not a level playing field. So even though the enrollment, in terms of getting enrolled at the senior secondary level has really improved over time. Yet, like in terms of attendance, in terms of like, educational attainments. So whether like all the women are able to, the girls as they are growing up, their real life experiences, which probably again takes us to, become like more conscious about the equal opportunities that we are trying to create, because otherwise the workforce participation only in terms of looking at a later stage, that making the place public safety is definitely an issue. We have all spoken about that. The mobility is an issue. Sexual harassment is an issue. So the sexual harassment, whether at public space, in transport or at workplace, that is an issue which needs to be looked at. And then the other thing is that when we look at like solutions, I was trying to like look at like from the government point of view, many schemes which are there for livelihood. So, a real mapping of those with a better rationalization of how they talk to each other. In one of the research, somebody said that departments not talking to each other. So coordination is a huge issue. So according to me, that is a big kind of takeaway for many, that where the coordination, when we look at a particular theme, livelihood, so mapping that and being able to bring a better convergence, with women at the center in this case. So when we put women at the center with rationalization of all the schemes, end-to-end approach with a better resource convergence, that will give us a combination of not just what we offer in terms of training, skill building, capacity enhancement, but also seeing, the same woman, if she's given a better social safety net, access to social security schemes, be it for her or for her family, then she's able to participate in the training better. She's able to, participate in any kind of enterprise, self-help groups, the group activities better because there is a safety net. And, government again, like in the caregiving role, I feel that while we have these schemes of creches and all, so probably like, we need to look at the, the kind of the norms, the quality and the quantity issue, because the scale at which it is required, be it creches, be it like, daycare center for the elderly, be it centers for the especially able persons of disability, because these are the three very huge areas because of which women often drop out. And access to technology, of course, but in terms of hardware, software, and training, so it's not possible maybe in every household, but at the same time, something where there's community, kind of space available, just as in we have business hubs, business centers. So we can have a common resource pool to promote small business. And that small business is not something only in terms of improving design, better connect to the market, but it's also probably in terms of access to the various kinds of services which today are needed. And government, again, there we can play a huge role in terms of mapping the kind of services and the products which are needed within the government itself. But why women lose out? Many of the women self-help groups, they lose out because of the lack of policy support. They lose out because we go into the traditional tender system. They lose out because we have our own general, the GFR norms. So there's some kind of when we say the incentive for women. So that kind of the protection in terms of, women being able to participate on an equal footing, when the choices are weighed heavily against them, when they have to go in for the similar kind of, contract negotiation, the tender documents, which probably they are not good at. So one is giving a support as an incentive, and the other is, that hand-holding facilitation, through these livelihood hubs. In Delhi, we are experimenting with some of these, and we are actually calling them local incubation centers. So incubation, which means that the facilitation, the initial facilitation, but at the same time mentoring, as a follow-through approach, without which it is not possible just as a startup, enterprise. So besides a startup, being able to provide support in terms of long-term, gestation, so that, the whatever they are doing in terms of providing care services, in terms of providing, maybe getting trained, to be in many of the government programs itself, there's a huge need. There are a lot of vacancies. So in terms of the field functionaries itself, so we don't always have to think about commodities and market, which are outside the government. So with these little words, and for the BCC, I just wanted to add, because I talked about government response and I talked about the response from the society. So the behavioral change communication, a sustained one, where we are challenging the typical gender roles and gender stereotype. And the Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao campaign, in a way, has started that trigger. But much more needs to be done, in terms of communitizing the whole thing. Even in terms of the functionaries who are responsible for taking these messages around, even their own understanding of the whole thing, needs to be really challenged all the time. And well, in terms of some of the other support services, I thought that looking at non-traditional areas, which combine public safety as well as provide livelihood, like cab drivers, bus drivers, conductors, all these, mandatorily making a particular percentage reserved for women, but training women to do that, supporting women to get into it. And when we talk about enterprise, so providing policy supports like working capital. So that goes a long way again. So these were some of my thoughts, and I'll be open to any question. Thank you.
Thank you, Rashmi ji, for these insightful comments. And I think you made a very important observation that when we talk about women in the workforce, it's a holistic approach that one needs to follow, and there are different aspects that we look into it. Could be at one level, training and education, the kind of jobs that are available, safety, plus the support that the women need when they are in the job market, and the information along with that, and then the various policy approaches that can be taken up by the government, and support that can be given. And I think a very interesting and encouraging outcome of the presentations today has been that in terms of social norms, at least there are two papers where we do see that there are changes in social norms that we could see due to government policy. For example, when free services, free bus tickets were provided, educated women took up more of these, prefer to travel more by bus. And like being in Delhi, I know from personal experience that many of the college going women hesitated to use the bus facilities precisely because of this safety issues or presence of un, un like not it wasn't a very uh, safe environment for them. So we do see, or say in Deep Shikha's work, we do see that there are, like in a small way, we do see that there are some social changes happening. So that's a very encouraging thing to observe, because government policy is can have the effect to change social norms, and now it's also likely to work in the other way around of increasing or pushing women more into the labor force. So I think most of the questions that were being asked by the guests have been answered by the speakers already. But in case if someone has questions, please feel free to type it out and ask your questions. And meanwhile, I would just like to make a few uh, like observations or questions to all the speakers. So, for example, one question that I have for Clement is, like in your study, you found that in general, women were more likely to take up or more likely to um, uh, be placed after the training program and less likely to drop out. So I was wondering that if given this, if we look at it from, or if we club this with what Nilanjan was talking about, that in general, women, in terms, women work less in urban areas and in non-agricultural sectors. So is are these results in your paper driven by the selectivity of the sample, where those like many dedicated and already much higher educated women are choosing to take these training programs?
Yeah, that's a good question, actually, because I was, after hearing all these interesting presentations and contributions, I was just wondering, what the bottleneck really is. And I think we've, of course, talked about education, social norms, mobility, and definitely childcare or family duties. And I think we've seen evidence of all of those, but given my research, and I think the evidence that's been presented, it seems that education might be an issue, but it's an issue that could be fixed. So in my example, in the sample we look at, we're not starting with with rich, educated young women. We're starting with, rural women who have not completed high school and, or just so, 10th pass or 12th pass max. So the government is coming and giving them a vocational training. And with that training in hand, they're ready to go. Like employers are ready to hire them. So the education bottleneck, so is there, but is something that seems to be fixable. The social norms, I won't say they don't exist. Everybody knows how they exist. However, there's at least, given what we see with all these, young women from disadvantaged background, from rural Jharkhand and Bihar, being able to go to take up work in Delhi and Bangalore, those social norms are there, but they're not like a wall that you can't go through. Okay, so there's at least a possibility. So I'm not saying that there's no selection. It could be there's still some women who are saying, "Oh no, I won't take it. I won't take that job." We've got maybe 40% of the women who don't take the job. So it is still going on. Now the mobility, again, like there are mobility frictions, but here this is a case of hand-holding, basically, because the training providers are, and I was there one night where a batch of female trainees were going off to Bangalore to work in a textile factory. There was a lot of emotion and it was like very hard, but at the same time, when it's organized and helps, it can happen. So again, it's a case maybe of where mobility is. Now, there's one thing that at the end of it seems to be a very strong, and here again, as you say, I think I join what Nilanjan has been talking about. There's a strong bottleneck, which is as soon as family duties kick in, then the game is basically over from the point of view of this young woman getting married. Once they get married, the expectations they take care of the kids, and that's not compatible, consistent. You can't do both. With a job in Bangalore, like in a factory in Bangalore. What is important to look at is to see that in Bangladesh it is happening in hundreds of thousands. So this is something. So that there's something interesting here, and that seems to be really a question. Might be the issue. So that was a bit my question to the others. I don't want to, you'll have other questions, but I think it was a bit the question I had, like in the end, for example, Nilanjan, at the end, you seem to be saying, oh, well, maybe no job is really consistent with taking care of the kids at home, except self-employment. And I think, I think this core also was hinting at some amount of businesses as well. So is at the end the only goal or achievable political goal to say, okay, we should help them develop their own businesses, or are there things that could be tried for, to make this service jobs consistent with being married and having children, basically?
Thanks, Claude. So now I have a question which is directed both to Deepika and Gabriel. Both your studies sort of see a change in social norms in some way that we do not there's some change in behavior, and how do you think that would affect the labor market prospects of women? I would like both of you to respond to that, and particularly in terms of COVID, do you think that has dampened it, or there is a possibility of that getting exaggerated?
Thank you for the question. Yes, gender norms, as we all know, are including childcare responsibilities, are a huge dampener for women's employment. And that's what we've been discussing, maybe self-employment, as Professor Clement was also mentioning, and Dr. Kaur was also mentioning. I feel that we need to have, in my study, I find that men with progressive gender attitudes were working better with women in mixed gender teams than those with regressive gender attitudes. So we need to work on maybe we can have programs within organizations on improving gender attitudes, and programs on sexual harassment and like all those these kind of policies within organizations. But first of all, we need to attract women to these workplaces. So for that, apart from providing free transportation, with which Professor Gabriel can talk about more in more detail, we can incentivize firms or provide a clear and transparent fiscal stimulus as provided in call center industries to open up in smaller towns. So that can also be something that can be policy wise can be rolled out. Like here, policymakers were ensuring that call centers were opening up in smaller towns, and even villages in Bihar some villages do have call centers now opening up. So then they don't have to travel so much for work, and they can possibly, combine their childcare and household responsibilities. So if the firms were given these additional incentives to open up in smaller towns and hire women, so they were given special incentives in the call centers to hire women and specially abled individuals. So these kind of policies might impact and increase female labor force participation. But on the demand side, we do have to work and provide fiscal stimulus to firms for job creation, especially in the post-pandemic world, because there's going to be more competition in the post-pandemic world, and women. And as we see in the pandemic, women have lost more jobs, and because they are also the most vulnerable. So it has COVID-19 pandemic has increased the pre-existing vulnerabilities, and it has pushed people who are lower educated and less skilled out of the labor market, and particularly women. So in order to make women more competitive in the make more women more attractive, there has to be more demand side effort, maybe even job assistance programs, and even within the skill program we can give special incentives for women only groups to travel, and so those kind of policies catering to women will have to be primary, in my
Thanks,
opinion.
Deepika. Gabriel, could you just...
Thanks very much. And I just want to thank all the speakers. I've learned a lot so far in this panel. I want to say something about the interplay between safety and urban mobility and social norms, because it's a really interesting interplay. The first is definitely safety considerations matter for economic outcomes. So my co-author Girija Burkar has a paper showing how women in Delhi choose lower quality colleges to go to because of the trade-offs imposed by safety and the commutes that they have available. It's very easy to imagine how this generalizes to the labor market in cities. The second point is that it's kind of this theoretical distinction that Seema Jayachandran, among others, kind of raises, that one is women's choices and their preferences about these trade-offs, and the other one is how social norms emerge to control women and use this as a way to limit their mobility. And those are very distinct, and it's very important to keep this distinction in mind. So, and the third one is, of course, the question is, what are the policies that alleviate and kind of improve safety? And here, one thing I say is clearly it's very difficult. There are studies ongoing to kind of understand better, and what can work. And I showed these results about the bus marshal program, which might need a longer time period, or or tweaks for it to work. But also there can be unintended consequences. So I want to cite a study from Brazil, from Rio de Janeiro, that documented, so their trains have women-only cars, and the authors document that this helps with decrease the risk of harassment, but it also creates in the population a perception that women who don't use this mode are more inviting of harassment. So this kind of backfiring is an issue. I'll leave it here, and in terms of COVID, I would like to hear more from other speakers. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Unfortunately, we are coming to a close. But before that, I would like to address my question both to Harjot and Rashmi. Ma'am, if you could say from a policymaker's perspective, this COVID shock, like we all discussed about, is a once in a lifetime shock which has so many dimensions, and particularly women would be more vulnerable to it. So as policymakers, what kind of where do you think is the immediate response that one needs to address in order to address this challenge, particularly for women?
Okay, so I think targeted intervention with combination of safety net in terms of there are many programs across different states where cash transfer is happening to the vulnerable groups, even to the self-help groups and all. So that as an immediate measure with some plans for providing I would say alternate livelihood options. I was talking to a group of vendors yesterday, women street vendors. Now, no matter what you try, street vending, you can't really, keep pushing the same thing, which probably won't work for some more time at least that I can see in the near future. But at the same time, there are alternate ways in which the mapping and matching, which I talked about. So that mapping, matching, and measuring. So these three things, if we do, situated to today's, reality, the current context, it will definitely bring a better result. So that kind of combination is needed today.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
Would you like to give your...
First of all, I would like to say that when I was stressing on digital literacy, I did not mean that women have it easy. Of course, the gender norms are there. And I would agree with Mr. Gabriel Frenda when he says that you must have also take into account unintended consequences. I somehow feel that, of course, government as such has to go for a policy interventions to take care of various issues which affect women, starting from their home till the time they are into an office or whatever. Lots of issues in that. But more than that, I think we also need to really focus on the social norms. As somebody had said, that if you have more progressive male counterparts in office, a woman finds it more easier to work in that space. Similarly, more progressive people in the household or in the village also help her move out of the house and go for a job, and even search for a job maybe at a little distance away. Just to say that, as Mr. Gabriel had also said, if you do not have all women buses, do we want to say that women should stay at home? If we do not have schools in your own village, supposing there's not a primary school in your particular village, is that an excuse for parents to say that I will not send my child, female child, to study? If there is a skill set somewhere and you say, I think it's better you get married at 18 and go to your own household rather than give her an opportunity to study and be an individual in her own right, is that the right effort? So I think the government also has a very major role in changing social norms. And of course, the income effect, everybody has talked about it. Why in India, even in higher income households, it's still considered very good that, okay, why do you need to work? Your husband is really having a very good salary. Why is the need to work? Stay at home, look after the kids, enjoy life. That is the general norm that we find in India. If a person is having a particular income, there is no need for women to go out to work. She should stay at home. This is across educational, higher educational attainments and all that. You will find generally people are much more gender neutral in the lower sections of society, because for them it's a case of survival, so they don't bother whether the women are in or out of the house. So I think, of course, working on women issues, the gender disparities which women have, which they've been facing over the years, we definitely have to take care of that. But I think more than that, we need to tell a woman that you're a woman, you're a human being first, you have your own rights, and I think you should start looking at yourself like a woman and not somebody who is like mentored by so many other people that don't go outside, something bad will happen to you, don't go to school, something. But it's always a case of something bad is going to happen to you. I think that is something you have to change yourself also. So as they say, charity begins at home. Sometimes I think in the narrative in the school or in various programs that we have, we must have some gender education classes for women as such, so that they are able to at least distinguish between things. It's a very small example I would like to give. We had screened the film Thappad for various women across the sections, and it was very interesting to see the reaction of women coming from different strata of society or the income group. So there were women who were from educational or middle classes, or who really thought, okay, it was a very good movie and maybe it is the norm. And there were many girls who were from that vocational studies classes who were not very highly educated, and they were all giggling and they were saying कि एक थप्पड़ ही तो है, इसके लिए इतना ज़्यादा सोचने की क्या ज़रूरत पड़ी है, घर ही तोड़ दिया अपना. So it also happens as to from where you are coming, whatever the government gives, as we've all been talking about from day one to day out. that the demand also has to be there. It can't only be a supply side question that you're giving everything to women and there is no demand coming out from there. So unless and until the woman herself also wants to come out, or she gets that kind of an atmosphere at home where she's treated as an equal person, I think it'll be a big battle for her. And of course, that is again not to say that as a policymaker or as a government servant, I'm saying that we do not need to look into each and every aspect of women's life. And wherever we can facilitate her, make her life a little easier and make it easier for her to come out from her house and get a job, I think we should try to do that. But by doing that, we should not generally forget the bigger question that the woman herself also needs empowerment.
Thanks, Ajoti. Sorry, I have to cut you short because we are really 9 minutes past our stipulated time. So I would now invite Professor Ghosh, who is the member secretary of Asian Development Research Institute, to conclude the panel and give the vote of thanks to all the participants. Professor Ghosh, please unmute yourself. Please unmute yourself.
Is it done? Can I hear you? Can you hear?
Yes, you are audible.
Yeah. Friends, it has been long 3 hours, taxing our span and attention. So I will be very brief in my thanks. Before I say thanks, 1 or 2 comments about the 2 sets of studies. The first one on state capacity and the second one on women labor force. In the 3 studies on state capacity by Drew Cameron and Emily and Uma, I noticed that in all these 3 programs, short-term subsidy or cleanliness or urban solid management, the whole thing goes much beyond what you call resources and techno-managerial aspects of the program. Okay, in all these 3 programs, the behavioral aspects of the citizens play a great role, substantial role in these programs. So those who have been doing this study should try to make a distinction between the resource part and the techno-managerial part and the behavioral part. I think that's very important for us to know. So where the second one is concerned, here, only thing that I have to mention is that I think Deepshika mentioned it in her supplementary comments, that the 4 studies by Klime, Deepshika, Gabriel, and Niranjan, they're all from the supply side, which women are offering themselves for work. It does not take into account the demand side of the problem. Now, demand side is much more difficult, but fortunately, in the Indian context, if you do regional studies, okay, you take Kerala, you take Madhya Pradesh, you take Maharashtra, you take Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, each one state offers a completely different demand pattern. And if you make a comparison of the state-wise data, it will probably give us some idea about the impact of the demand variables in the labor participation. I'm also, I think the pattern in Bangladesh, where the present level is something like 37% women's labor participation, and it is increasing, has got more to do with the fact that Bangladesh's economy has been doing much better in recent decades. That's the one. So that's the 2 comments I had to make. I wholeheartedly thank all the authors. I also thank Sri Arvind Chaudhary, MS Harjit Kaur Bumrah, and MS Rashmi Singh for their valuable comments from their based on their administrative experience. Thanks to Ashmita also for doing considering the second session. I'm not thanking Pranab because he is the host. And I also thank at the end, very importantly, Kumar Das for organizing the whole thing. Thank you very much.